much. Hello, I'm Dr. Anya Waite, the CEO and Scientific Director of the Ocean Frontier Institute. I'm also Associate Vice President Research for Ocean Research here at Dalhousie University. I would like to recognize that the Ocean Frontier Institute's physical offices are located on ancestral and traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups in Atlantic Canada. Our institute is working hard to advance respectful and meaningful partnerships with Indigenous peoples. So welcome to the Ocean Frontier Institute's Social Sciences and Humanities Working Group, People and the Ocean Speaker Series. This is the last of 8 webinars this year, all featuring international experts who seek to understand complex interactions between society, economy, culture, and marine and coastal environments. Thank you very much for being here, and my sincere thanks to this working group for organizing this most impressive webinar series. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Charles Mather, who's Associate Professor and OFI Module Co-Lead at Memorial University, who will now introduce today's speaker and the discussants, and he will also moderate today's session. So over to you, Charles.
Thank you so much, Anya. So for this final webinar, and it's been a really extraordinary set of presentations and webinars over the last few months, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Max Liboiron, Métis Scholar and Associate Professor in the Department of Geography. Introducing Max is no easy task. There are many things I could highlight, but here I want to focus on 3 aspects of their career that I think will give people a sense of who Max is as scholar and activist. First, Max is director of CLEAR, the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research. This is a feminist anti-colonial lab that describes itself as a research space, methods incubator, and a social collective. It has played a key role here at Memorial and far beyond in helping us rethink the role of a laboratory in the university. The lab has generated a great deal of research, mainly around marine plastics, but its lasting impact will no doubt be how it reshapes laboratory life in other places and other spaces. Second, Max is widely published in the field of marine plastics, and their most recent publication is in the form of a book-length manuscript called Pollution is Colonialism. This is an extraordinary contribution to helping us rethink pollution, discards, and waste in the context of ongoing colonial relations. It is an amazing read, so accessible and so well written and so interestingly structured. And it comes as no surprise that it has already won several awards. Pollution is Colonialism is a significant and important contribution to both natural and social science scholarship. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it during Max's presentation. So with all this critical and important scholarship and research work, you'd think that Max would have no time for administrative work, but you'd be wrong. Here at Memorial, they've played a critical role in establishing a new policy on research impacting Indigenous groups. This is a policy that meets but also exceeds Tri-Council guidelines and will no doubt be the blueprint for other universities as they develop their own Indigenous research policies. So welcome, Max, and thanks so much for agreeing to do this presentation. I'd also like to introduce our 2 commentators. The first is Dr. Jamie Snook. Jamie has mixed Inuit ancestry and is from Mary's Harbour within the Nunatukavut Community Council territory. He has for many years been involved in wildlife research and resource management through his role with the Twangat Wildlife Plants and Fisheries Secretariat. Jamie completed his PhD recently at the University of Guelph in public health on the ways wildlife co-management intersect with Inuit well-being. There are a number of really interesting papers and publications that are in press and are emerging out of his PhD work, and I look forward to hearing his comments as discussant on Max's presentation. The second commentator is Elder Calvin White. Elder White is Mi'kmaq, born and raised in Flat Bay, Newfoundland and Labrador. Elder White is one of the founders of the Aboriginal revival in the province and has played a key role in the successful negotiation with the government to form the Khalipu Mi'kmaq First Nation. For this role, Elder White received the Order of Newfoundland and Labrador in 2015, an Honorary Doctor of Laws in 2017, and the Order of Canada in 2019. These honors recognize the role Elder White played in achieving recognition for First Nations groups in the province. And I'm also very much looking forward to his comments on Max's presentation, which is entitled Research is a Land Relation. So the format for this presentation or for this session will be that Max will start with a 30-minute presentation. We'll then turn to Elder Calvin White for comments and observations and responses, and then to Jamie Snook for the same. We'll allow Max to respond to those comments, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. I would ask that people use the Q&A when they will be asking questions, and not the chat. The chat, well, we won't see what's going on in the chat. Okay, so with all that, thank you so much, Max, for doing this, and I would look forward to hearing your presentation.
Merci, Charlie. Tanche, Kia, Max Liboiron, Delphine Kashun, l'activiste du Chien, Nikia Mitineshun. Thank you for that introduction, Charlie. I really appreciate it. I'm speaking to you today from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. I can see from the participants, that most of you are from or near the province, so I don't have to talk to you about where St. John's is necessarily. It is on the homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and the wider province are also the homelands of the Innu and the Inuit. I'm Michif, or Red River Métis, and so I'm really far from my homelands in sort of an arc from Alberta to Manitoba. And so I'm an uninvited visitor here on the homelands of, well, Dr. Snook and Elder White. So you're probably quite used to land acknowledgements by now. Anya gave one. I just gave one. And what I really like about land acknowledgements is that they foreground land relations at the start of a conversation and a set of relationships, which is how you're supposed to start discussions and relationships. If we were indoors in a room, we could look and see what the walls looked like and what architectural styles they were in. We could think about the pipes in those walls, where the water was coming from, where the sewage was going to, and those land relations. We could see who was in the room and who wasn't in the room and think about that as land relations. We can still do that in a virtual space. There's still electricity coming from someplace, pollution going somewhere else from that electricity generation. And so those sorts of relations are already grounding the conversation we're having and letting some things happen and other things not happen in certain ways. There's also, of course, a very well-earned critique of land acknowledgements, mostly from Indigenous folks, that they don't scale often or almost ever. Doing land acknowledgement doesn't change or address colonial land relations. And the other critique is that land acknowledgements becoming ever more popular, especially in universities, is that they can ingrain colonial land relations because it looks like something's being done. It looks like someone's on the right side. It looks like Indigenous presence is being acknowledged, or in sometimes creepy fashion, even celebrated. So we're good to go, but nothing has changed. Land relations are still exactly how they were before we started doing a lot of land acknowledgements, and including more Indigenous authors or people in your bibliographies or syllabi or staff components or speaker series also doesn't necessarily change, or almost ever change, land relations. It might be a step, but it doesn't often scale. That being said, a few years ago, back when traveling seemed like a good idea, I was at an NSERC working group committee meeting. NSERC was trying to do diversity better, basically, the major funder of science in Canada. And they invited some Indigenous folks, including me, and they didn't do a land acknowledgement. So we're like, wah, 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 why didn't you do one? And they said, oh, we heard there were critiques of land acknowledgements, so now we just skip them. The ability to just erase Indigenous people in white or settler dominated spaces because to do otherwise is fraught or hard or critiqued is also a land relation. And so the point of a lot of my work is in that moment when things are hard and there's no obvious, easy, or perfectly good way forward. How do you stay in good land relations in these fraught territories? Because they will always be fraught. And so I do land acknowledgements both because it was what I'm told to do by my elders, and particularly my godfather, and also because I think erasure is worse than tokenism. And I hope that's not a radical statement. So whether you're introducing yourself or whether you're working in the field, doing research where the field is someone's home or backyard or homelands, whether you're reading or writing or teaching, everything you do can be called a method. It's what I would call a method. And methods always have land relations. They always reproduce colonial or anti-colonial or some sort of land relations. So whenever I say method throughout this talk, you can immediately think, oh, I'm also saying land relation. So I'm going to be talking for about half an hour, like Charles said, and I'm going to be drawing pretty heavily from my book, Pollution is Colonialism. I used to call it my new book, but it's now been out almost exactly a year to the day. So thank you for coming to my book birthday, which I guess is all this week. And because I'm a methodologist, which in academic terms means that my main question is always how do you do things, not what is the thing or why is the thing, but how. This book is mostly a methods text, even though it's, on the cover it says it's about pollution, it is a methods text. So the research question today and always is how do you do things well in good land relations? So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about colonialism because it gets used in a very promiscuous way sometimes. So I'm going to be quite specific about what I mean. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Newfoundland and Labrador, which might get embarrassing because both of my discussants are from here and I'm not. So we'll see how that goes. Because one of the things that's important to methods is that it comes from a place. And to be in good land relations, you have specific obligations that might generalize to other places, but they will never universalize. They belong in a place. So I have to talk about place. And then I'll finish by talking about a method that we've developed in my lab, CLEAR, to deal with some of these fraught terrains around colonialism in science and research. And it's called community peer review. And then we'll do some respondents. I'm really, really, really looking forward to the respondents. So thank you very much, Alder White and Dr. Snook, for agreeing. I am nervous and excited. All right, so let us begin. So before we can work on trying to not do colonial land relations in our research or other things, we have to first deal with the ground we stand on. Before we can reinvent how we do things, we have to deal with how things are done, right? Our inheritances, and that includes colonialism. So colonialism is a way to describe relationships, and specifically relationships that are characterized by conquest and genocide in various ways and various scales, that grant colonial and settler access to Indigenous land. And it grants access in such a way that it meets settler and colonial goals, needs, desires, futures. So that means colonialism is more than just the intent or identities or heritages or values of settlers and their ancestors. It's about genocide and access. And in the book, I have this handy bumper sticker definition of colonialism. Non-Indigenous access to Indigenous land for non-Indigenous goals, needs, desires, futures. Now, this isn't a universal definition. There's different colonialisms in different parts of the world, and so they'll look different, and so will anti-colonialisms. But this one works pretty well in occupied territories. And when I say land, I just don't mean dirt and bees and trees, although I also mean dirt and bees and trees. I mean land in terms of how, say, designs or music comes out of land and how that can get appropriated in tattoos or clothes or music. It can mean access to Indigenous land for research, of course. It can mean using land as a resource and putting pipelines or drawing oil out of it, or even recycling plants, which also, by the way, cause a fair bit of pollution. It can even mean imagining things for land that are good, but meet non-Indigenous goals, like conducting beach cleanups for plastics on Indigenous land without permission or consent. So it can include well-intentioned and good and environmental ends as well. So one of the things I start the book with is a bunch of differentiations, the difference between colonialism and capitalism, how they're a bit different. And the other thing I talk about is how environmentalism and anti-colonialism are not necessarily synonymous. They can be, but not automatically. So there are really excellent Indigenous scholars like Kyle White, who's Potawatomi, Gillow Whitaker, who's Colville Confederated Tribes, and lots of others that talk about how environmental solutions to climate change and other things, things like hydroelectric dams, consumer responsibility, appeals to the commons, recycling, assume access to Indigenous land and its ability to produce value for settler and colonial desires and futures. And Sunday Ground talks about how environmentalism often, quote, propagates and maintains the dispossession of Indigenous people for the common good of the world, end quote. And we can think about things like Muskrat Falls and things like that in this province. It's not a far reach. And in my own work as an environmental scientist that studies plastic pollution, some of these assumed access to land sneak in ways that can be really hard to track back. So in pollution regulation and science, you might be familiar with this idea of what I call threshold, the threshold theory of pollution, which is the dominant theory in regulations in most of the world since the 1930s. This idea that a certain amount of pollution or contaminant can happen before harm occurs. So in Canada, we can have 0.010 milligrams of arsenic per liter of drinking water, and more than that is too much. We can have even less lead in tap water, 0.005 milligrams per liter, right? So basically it's this idea that specific quantities of contaminants are allowed legally in bodies of water, human bodies, air, food, environments, until it's dangerous. And it's based on this thing called assimilative capacity. So let me see if I can weather person this. So you have this idea that there's an increasing amount of contaminants and an increasing amount of harm. And the job of science is to locate the sweet spot, right? This little point here, where the concentration doesn't cause too much or sometimes any scientifically determinable harm in the environment. So this is where our 0.01 arsenic in drinking water is, for instance. This safe zone underneath is land. It's the use of land to metabolize or assimilate or dilute some of that pollution. So even the environmental, and what it does, this theory of assimilative capacity, what it does is it makes it seem like land is properly pollutable, naturally able to handle pollution, and so that becomes part of its job. So land becomes naturally and scientifically proven to be a sink for pollution. So even the environmental science that a lot of our activism and certainly our state laws, settler state laws, are premised on assume access to land for settler and colonial and industrial chemical goals, needs, desires, right? So I would call this a colonial land relation in most pollution regulation. So the point I'm trying to make is that colonialism isn't just one kind of thing with one set of techniques that always align with capitalism or always aligns against environmentalism. I'm not saying environmentalism or science are inherently bad or inherently colonial. I'm saying that something that can be good in one register can also still be colonial, right? And that's why I argue, along with many other people, that analyzing science, research methods in general, teaching, et cetera, from a colonial lens, as opposed to just diversity or inclusivity or something like that, is really crucial because they're different things. So that means a lot of my research and teaching is against what I would call purity politics, this idea of doing action from a clean slate, right? This idea that a lot of students and sometimes the popular media and others have, where you don't want to do interventions and action until you found a place that's devoid of compromise, devoid of contamination. There's no dirty money. The man is not there, whatever, right? But there's no such thing as a clean slate. And this idea of a clean slate, a prior for which there is no history, no legacy, nothing else existing there, actually comes out of colonial worldviews for this thing called terra nullius, the clean slate, the place where you can just project your intentions and start from scratch. There is no scratch. People and things have been happening since time immemorial, and that inheritance is part of what you have to do. And for all of us, Indigenous people, settlers, and others, we've already inherited colonial methods, values, and common sense in all sorts of different ways. And that's the ground we start from. So when you go to give a presentation, there's already this thing called land acknowledgements and their politics, and you have to deal with them in various ways. As the pollution scientist, I already have this as the bedrock that I sort of launch from, whether I want to or not. So this is why how, okay, given that hot mess, how do we maneuver that fraught space? And so I'll give an example of how we've done some of this in CLEAR, Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research. That's why we call it CLEAR. And whenever I talk to groups about thinking about anti-colonial methods, which basically means any kind of research message that interrupts or doesn't reproduce or does something different than this sort of colonial access thing, we always have to start from a place, right? So if you're thinking about land relations, they have to come from somewhere. So in the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, when I first came here, it's kind of obvious that codfish, especially on the island, is super important. It's why Newfoundland and Labrador was colonized a certain way. It's sort of the basis of various economic trajectories. It's still the center of life and livelihood for a lot of folks. There's a figure that 80% of people on the island eat fish once a week, usually cod, and further north, that number increases and the number of species in fish diversifies as changes char, right, this sort of stuff. And I usually, to general audiences, like explain the cod moratorium. For this particular group, and I think I saw Dean Bavington in the list, I talk about fishery science, and this is based, the clarity of this is based on Dean Bavington's book, Managed Annihilation, where when in the 1980s, as most of you will know, when the provincial government wanted to modernize, aka industrialize, they brought in fishery scientists because they wanted to find how much fish could be maximally extracted from the ocean without damaging too much the fish population. So they brought in folks to find the sweet spot. How much fish can we take out without damaging the population too much? And of course, the fishery scientists came up with some numbers, and those numbers didn't work because in 1991 or 1992, on July 1st, the cod moratorium collapsed. And about 1 in 4 people lost their job in the province, which is the largest job layoff in Canadian history, not per capita, just period, for those of you who don't know. And that's just the settler story and the settlers' figures of the cod collapse. So of the very many Indigenous groups in the province and communities in the province, you've got the commercial and sustenance angle as well, but then depending on who and where you are, you also have different relationships to fish that would also have been compromised and damaged. So for Métis folks, I'm not from here, but fish are our relatives, and we have certain obligations under what are called original instructions to them, and those would have been compromised in addition to these other ways. So what this means is the first day, the first moment I found plastic pollution in a cod, I was super excited for about half a second before I realized, oh my shit, I just found pollution in a cod, which is the heartbeat of Newfoundland, the island, using science, which is part of what led to the cod collapse to begin with, as a CFA, as a come from away. And if I wanted to talk about safe levels of plastics in fish, my recourse is assimilative capacity. So I was like, oh, this is maybe not so good. And so maybe you can see why my main research question is how, is a methodological question. How do I do this research? How do I not cause harm? How do I frame this? How do I understand what's happening? And maybe you can also see why how is not just a methods question, but always also an ethical question and what you might call an ontological question, or a question about what the world is like. So as I sat there with this piece of plastic on my finger and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to figure out what to do? The answer came to me. I do not know, and I cannot know what to do, what the implications of this are in this place to these people. And so what I needed to do was ask, because Newfoundlanders and Labradorians would know. And that was basically the beginning of what is now a fairly sophisticated process called community peer review. So I'm going to outline a little bit about how it works, and then I'll be done. So community peer review is shockingly like academic peer review. You go in front of a bunch of peers and you say, this is what I did, this is how I did it, this is what I found. Can you please give me your insights and tell me whether I can publish this, please? The two main differences with community peer review is that number one, it usually happens in Dart Halls, which is where this is in Ballian East, where this photo is taken. And who counts as a peer is quite different. So rather than a bunch of academics, it's people who are most impacted by the research. So in this case, the places where we got the fish for my first set of studies, which are mostly small settler fishing communities within a short drive from St. John's. So community peer review is one way that we think about community self-determination in research. So for us, for me, and for people in CLEAR, community peer review is about land and obligations. This assumption that researchers can just have access to land, Indigenous land, collective land, community land, broadly to all of those things and how they overlap. Part of that assumption is you can just go places and get data, and that is inherently good because making more knowledge, however it's done, is inherently good. And community peer review interrupts that. So yeah, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. It also addresses a few acute issues of knowledge. So me, as an expert academic, I cannot possibly know, number one, how my research might harm or benefit communities. I've done a ton of ethics forms, including one actually this morning, where it says, please list the harms and benefits. And I'm like, here's what I think, and it will almost always be wrong, because those things need to come from community. And I can talk more about that in a bit. Number two, the other thing I don't know as an expert are the framings and analysis that are most relevant and meaningful outside of the academy for the research. So I've been doing plastic pollution research for about 7 years, exclusively or almost exclusively in food webs, and often in the same places. And not a single time have the scientific community priorities for research and the local community priorities for research aligned. Don't agree on species, don't agree on what kind of measurements to take or what a good sample size is or where a good sample site sort of design is, don't agree on the framework, so even if though they're on the same topic, they diverge and you can't really know what it's going to be as a scientist or researcher. And then third, what I can't know as an expert is whether this knowledge should circulate and on what grounds. So Indigenous scholars like Audra Simpson, like Eve Tuck, like Sandy Grand and others have written about this idea called refusal, which is very central to different Indigenous methodologies and also I would say governance. So refusal is part of ensuring, it's basically saying no. Rather than the terms of accommodation for research or governance being determined by and in the interest of the hegemonic or more powerful group, which is the researcher, communities set the terms of how and whether research that impacts them should occur, should be conducted and circulate. So it's a way to keep local and community knowledge from having a unidirectional relationship where it just gets sort of vacuumed out of communities and the value accrues to academic authors, right? So that means that refusal is not just a denial, although it's that too, it's also an affirmation of ideas unacknowledged and unquestioned, and an affirmation of how things should be done, and usually an affirmation of good land relations. So over time, my and Claire's methods of community peer review have become more and more sophisticated. So the first time I did this, is where this picture comes from, comes at the end of research. But now we don't go anywhere without an explicit invitation. We don't do research anywhere that we haven't been invited into. And so community peer review starts when we're trying to figure out our research question, because again, the academic community and local communities don't have a good idea of what best serves folks. And also we've started to pair it with something called Indigenous data sovereignty. I know my big head's in the way of this, so let me take my big head out for a moment. If you want to screenshot it or read it, I also have a bibliographic reference at the end if you want. So Indigenous data sovereignty is about how Indigenous groups own, control, have access to, and possess the data that concerns them or comes from their land. So what happens is when I collect samples and we put them into our spreadsheets, when we work with Nunatsiavut government, which is mostly who we work with these days, their staff have access, like passwords into all of our shared data sheets, and they own it all, they control it all. So I have to constantly earn my way back into that spreadsheet. So I just can't take it and calculate it. I have to ask permission to access it so I can go calculate it. Then I have to ask permission to talk about it on the news or to present about it in a conference. And so it's the hallmarks of proper consent. I think, as we know, you don't have real consent if there's not the possibility of very real and robust refusal, right? And so this is what community peer review and data sovereignty bakes into the relationship. And yeah, I can talk more about data as land and land relations if you want to in the Q&A. So I hope what you can tell from this talk, winding down, is that that land isn't just dirt and bees and trees. It's also, and specifically, people and communities, histories and thus legacies, and how these things co-determine each other, which sometimes we mean when we say relations. And we know this, when we do a land acknowledgement, we don't usually talk about birds and bees and trees, although sometimes we do talk about communities, legacies, histories, obligations, responsibilities. And so I always end by asking people if they want to sort of take up these ideas of doing research in a way that interrupts non-Indigenous access to Indigenous land for non-Indigenous goals. What are the land relations where you do your work, whether that's administration or research or teaching or learning, where you do your work at the institution, at your sites of study, in your disciplines? They will almost always have a lot of these sneaky colonial relationships involved, like a symbol of capacity. And in CLEAR, we talk a lot about protocol. So not just intention, it's insufficient, necessary, but insufficient to intend to do things better. But you actually need actions, steps that start pointing you in a different direction. And so I hope what's started here is maybe some ideas about how to turn our nose a little bit in a different direction towards good land relations. So thank you for listening. Here's a bibliography. I will get my head out of the way again. And I very much look forward to Elder White and Dr. Snook's feedback.
Thank you so much, Max. Okay, so over to you, Elder White, for comments and observations on Max's presentation.
Oh, his mic is off.
I think you're muted,
Admin
Elder
people
White.
turn his mic on, please. That guy.
No.
Guy from Florida. I've forgotten your name, sorry. Can you turn on the mic? It's on the bottom of the screen on the left. It says mute underneath Calvin. No, still not. Uh-oh. Tech people say that can't turn it on.
Oh.
Calvin, do you want to leave and come back? It's the only thing I can think of. Or call one of your smart nearby people. It's still not working.
Yeah.
Jamie, do you want to try going first, and then we'll see what happens with Elder White?
Yeah, let's do that. Jamie, you okay going first?
Yeah, no, I'm okay. And if he wants to jump in when he gets back, that's fine too. And I really appreciate it and enjoyed the talk, Dr. Liboiron, and congratulations on your one-year book birthday. So that's quite nice. And I too wanted to acknowledge that I'm participating from traditional Innu and Inuit land here in Happy Valley Goose Bay, and I do think the land acknowledgements are important and really could resonate with the thoughts that you brought up. And I could just go from my own lived experience being born on the Labrador coast. I could speak to how being in place really shapes who we are and the culture and what a lot of people spend their livelihoods at today. And I was particularly interested when you brought up the example of the cod fishery, just because my family is from Battle Harbor, Labrador, which has a long history with the cod fishery, obviously. And when I was graduating high school, that's right when the moratorium was happening in this province. So it was such a not sure what the right way to say it is, but it really still sticks with me to this day how impactful that was, and the amount of income insecurity that there was for people throughout the province, including members of my own family and so on. It was really interesting. And I know a lot of transition has happened over the last couple of decades to species like crab and shrimp, but in my work with the Torngat Joint Fisheries Board in the Natsivut, when you talk to Inuit in the Natsivut about fisheries, they're very quick to go back to the cod fishery first. There's a lot of memories that and hard feelings that still resonate with the way the cod fishery disappeared in the Nazi, but at a time before there was DFO science, and there was certainly a lot of colonialism happening. I know I sat and listened to a lot of stories about people knowing the cod were disappearing, but there were certainly no one listening or taking any action. And those cod for people in the Nazi vote could have been used for subsistence. So it was really interesting to even hear stories of how in some cases people weren't even eating it as much because it had to be sold. But there's a lot of resentment because of the way that fishery disappeared. And when you fast forward to the moratorium and when fish disappeared in the rest of our province, there was a lot of economic adjustments and programs and so on, and none of that happened in the Nazi when that fishery had disappeared. So there's what developed was a huge inequity, you could argue, and that legacy still emerges today when we're in modern fish management discussions. And in line with your theories in the book, you could argue that a lot of things were not done right there by Inuit people who relied on codfish. And I think to this day, people don't necessarily associate Inuit with cod the way they should. There's these stereotypes of other species maybe that are more important or synonymous with Inuit culture, but the codfish was very, very important. And I won't go on and on because I know Elder White is back, I think, and has a mic. But one of the things that also resonates for me with this is the fact that these fish resources, and when I say fish, and water, I'm referring to land as well. I'm sure you do as well in your definition of land, and just knowing that those resources are so vital to healthy communities in Nunavut, and knowing that so little equitable access to those resources are available, I think that's a real challenge and something people need to reflect on. And one of the most glaring examples of an issue that we've spoke out about in recent years is a clause under the Fisheries Act where DFO can use fish for science. So, for example, in the case of northern shrimp, there's a large allocation of shrimp that's being used to fund science, and that therefore that's not available for local Inuit governments and communities and so on. So the colonial system and the government of the day is still doing things in a way that can be argued that are not necessarily good land relations, and certainly not in the spirit of reconciliation with Indigenous people. And that's where in a lot of cases now it dovetails into some of your points about refusal, and that if things aren't going to be done in a good way, maybe it's better to refuse to participate and leave fish in the water and protect areas and at least have a good environment if things can't be done for the benefit of adjacent peoples and communities. So I really enjoyed your talk and making people think through the idea of methods and doing research in a good way. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks so much.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Good.
Totally.
What I could do is I could sign my name to the bottom of Jamie's presentation, and that's it. It's it, because it's basically the same story almost everywhere you go. But to try not to be repetitive, just a couple of things that I certainly like to to share. We view culture here as a philosophy. Philosophy is our culture. That's what it is. And while I'm not speaking for the entire community, I feel very comfortable in saying that, very confident in saying that I am speaking for the majority of the community, because I'm 79 years of age. I was born in this community, raised in this community, and I went through the phases of when we were very, very self-sufficient. For instance, without having to go into a draw to find out if we were going to be successful in getting a moose or a caribou license. Also living in a time when I wasn't barred, or I should say my father, my grandfather, my uncles wasn't barred from fishing until there was a recreation period. And that may come when the weather is the worst of all times, as you know, when you live on the waters of Newfoundland. So we enjoyed the freedom, and it was our lifestyle. What I tried to do is I made a few notes to try to address all of those points, including some that's already been expressed by Jamie. First of all, like I want to say right up front, I'm not opposed to development. I've never been opposed to development. I understand the necessity of development, but I am opposed to environmental destruction. I'm opposed to neglect of remediation. I'm opposed to water pollution. And I'm opposed to the exploitation of natural resources without giving an opportunity for the replenishing of these resources. And what are we looking for? We expect consultation. And if development is to go ahead, we also expect and would want to enjoy profit sharing, as well as oversight in management, because we have been the managers of our territory long before colonialism and long before Europeans started to use the lands of our ancestors. Sure, Newfoundlanders may have come to the shore. No, the European people who are now the forefathers of the people who are here today, who consider themselves to be Newfoundlanders, no question about it. They came here for the fishing, and they stayed at the fishing. You know, it wasn't until 1822 that the very first white man by the name of W.E. Cormack traveled the interior of Newfoundland with a Mi'kmaq guide from Conn River to bring him to the Bay St. George area. Of course, he was looking for biotics at the time, but there was no intrusion upon our land and our territories until then. So we expect to be included. We expect consultation and profit sharing, as well as oversight, which I've already mentioned. Because we are the protectors. That's our history, that's our culture. Habitat for Mi'kmaq people is the land and the ocean. Vegetation, animals, fish is our food. Our medicines, our mental and physical wellness comes from the land. Year round, not only certain tourist seasons, it's an year-round activity. You know, we're hunting and trapping in the wintertime. Now we're using snowmobiles, where one time we used dog and sled and snowshoes. But that's our activities. You know, the profit from trapping is not something that attracts a person now. I can't find the word that I'm looking for here, but what it is the peace of mind. It's what takes you on the land and gives you the opportunity to be able to practice something that you know that's been in your blood for thousands of years. And it takes you out of the other kind of trouble that you may get into. You know, if I can take my son and my grandson on the land at a very early age and teach them the ways that was taught to me by my father, my grandfather, my uncles, and other elders in the communities, that might be the one night that I kept them away from smoking pot down at somebody's basement, or maybe in somebody's man shed that they call now. It might be the one time that I'm going to keep them out of a car where they or somebody else is going to be the drunken driver. So it has all kinds of unforeseen values when we talk about using the land for other than just our food, but also for our well-being. My community, we have a very fragile ecosystem. You know, in 2,500 square kilometers, we enjoy 11 of the greatest Atlantic salmon rivers, probably in North America. Our community is situated on ocean front, offering a variety of species. Our backyard, 60 kilometers of unoccupied land, home to moose, caribou, black bear, beaver, rabbits, and many other fur-bearing animals. That's why our people settled in this specific location. They probably could have went to St. John's, but what do they have on the Avalon, with all due respect to the people who live there, that would be attractive to an Aboriginal person? They have a few moose now over the last 20 years, but prior to that, they probably had to drive to central Newfoundland before they saw a moose. Our people decided to settle in this part of the island because of its bounty. This was, and still yet today, timber, medicine, wild berries, no less than a dozen species of both, you know. Why are we so infuriated, I guess, by what's happening around us and we can't control? You know, I always present in the terms of honesty. So sometimes I miss political correctness, but I have a mistrust in politicians, bureaucrats, and big corporations. Also, scientists and environmentalists who are paid by government and big business. They seldom will bite the hand that feeds them. And how many times, and I'm not asking any of you to agree with me, but I'm stating a fact based on my own personal experiences of life. How many times have environmentalists or scientists written reports that they felt was so important in the way that it was presented, only to have their superiors who was paying the check send it back to them for a second draft, and if necessary, a third draft, until it was watered down enough to say what big business wanted to hear? That's how it moved forward. Now, I may be making facts here or stating what I perceive to be facts that there's no evidence whatsoever to substantiate or to support. But based on all of the issues that I have experienced in a lifetime and the knowledge that has been handed to me from generation to generation, I feel comfortable enough to make these kind of statements. What we hope for is we hope for a change in that. We hope that people who are charged with the responsibility of doing environmental impact statements for whatever corporation, whatever government, that they come to us and they include us in their findings. And we can talk about the fragile area that we decided to settle in from our nomadic ways when the Europeans started influxing and starting cutting us off from the entire travel, where once we occupied about half of the southwest coast of Newfoundland, we now occupy and use smaller jurisdictions because it's been encroached upon by Europeans. We want involvement. We need to be included. So hopefully, if not a full paragraph, we'll get a couple of lines in that environmental statement that talks about things that need to be addressed instead of being ignored. I don't want, and I've never advocated, when it comes to challenging and arguing for inclusion for our rights. I understand and I believe that a dozen Indians holding placards are only empowering the perpetrators. That's all we're doing. We must infiltrate and educate, building a more concerned population. If we can find allies who feel about the environment and feel about the importance of protecting that are non-Aboriginal people, then we become more powerful, we become stronger. Because up to this point in time in the history since contact, Aboriginal people have been ignored. Our voices have not been heard. Yet, I would like to boast that we are the experts because we live on that land, we use that land, we occupy that land. And the same with the waters. In our community, the waters, the ocean is as important as the land because part of our food comes from the land, the other part of it comes from the ocean. Part of our recreation is on the land, part of our recreation is on the ocean. Another reason why our people settled here, and this is recorded in our history, was because of the abundance of eels that were available during the winter times. So if the snow was really too deep that the caribou weren't traveling, or the hunters themselves couldn't travel because of the depth of the snow, instead of starving, our people could go to the ice, the seals. They could also cut holes on the inside harbor of Flat Bay and spear eels any time of the winter months. So there was a survival there. So we've not been given a chance or never given an opportunity to be able to address these issues. I focus and I encourage and I promote education of the tools of our young people today. Because as I said earlier, I don't think we're going to make the changes carrying placards down the street, but we can make the changes to the board tables, in the boardrooms. We can make the changes if we have people elected to federal and provincial governments, that we have a voice. It'll take a while to get it heard, but it will be heard. And I congratulate Max for the career that she's choosing, because we also need people in all of the careers in society to be a voice for our people. I was never afraid of integration. Never. I have integrated. That's why we don't live in wigwams anymore. We live in houses. That's why we drive cars instead of dog sleighs. My biggest fear, and the one that I always challenge myself not to let myself fall into the trap, is not integration, it's assimilation. Because assimilation would be when I would lose my philosophy as an Aboriginal person of my purpose here and my need to promote and advocate for the protection of Mother Earth and our oceans. I really appreciate the fact that I was invited here today to listen, to hear, and to share. I don't know how come, Jamie, you and our paths have never crossed. I mean, you're in Labrador, you're not that far away. I guess it's because of the age difference. You were probably not even born when I was in Labrador. Bart Jack was a real good friend of mine. Actually, we started the Aboriginal movement in 1971, I think it was called the Native Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. And myself and Bart Jack and Marilyn John and a number of other people. And we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. And I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Elder White. Very powerful set of statements. So now I'll ask Max to respond to both Dr. Snook and Elder White's statements, and then we can open it up for questions from the audience. And for the audience members, I'd encourage you to start putting material into the Q&A while Max responds to the very interesting responses from our two discussants. Over to you, Max.
I think Elder White put it best. Just like, I should just sign my name to all that and be like, yeah, that's it. And I feel like both Dr. Snook and Elder White just gave examples, more examples for some of the things I was talking about, right? You just can't access land and do what you want with it. Research is a way through to get good land relations, what Elder White called education and stuff too. So, I mean, just more of the same. And it's always humbling, and I always appreciate when people make very similar arguments to what I'm trying to make, but do it in very plain language without words like ontology or methodology, which is exactly, I think, what just happened, right? So I very much appreciate it. I feel like part of my job is to like fancy up and put a hat on some of the things that these folks have literally just said so that it can circulate in different places. I feel like that's part of my job. So I'm glad we all got together here and got to hear each other. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Max. I don't see any questions right now, so I might just start by asking you a question, and then we can, well, we have one now. So I'll turn to that, the questions that just popped up in the chat. So the question is from Garrett Richards. It's, what additional advice might the panel give for how to teach research methods?
Do one of the two of you want to start with that?
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Max.
Okay.
I can make a comment if you want, or maybe, okay, you go ahead, Max.
No, you go first.
Okay. I was just going to say to Garrett's question that I think the word relation in the presentation is one that requires a lot of focus, and the fact that in a lot of the indigenous communities and regions, relationships are pretty much everything, and it takes a lot of time. And I know, or I'm assuming a lot of the people that are probably on this webinar are researchers, and in some cases looking to do research in indigenous communities. I know there's pots of money out there now that sometimes makes it look like it's the in-fashion thing to have an indigenous partner and so on. And it sort of circles back to this point that was made earlier about tokenism, and indigenous people can see through that when people show up and they're not really a partner, but just maybe their name is wanted on a grant application or so on. So when it comes to teaching research methods in this context, I think a lot of time has to be spent on relationship building and actually spending time in communities and actually identifying what the priorities are, and then seeing where there may be intersections with your discipline or your research project. But if you're leading in with your point of view, it's not very likely it's going to line up with what the priority is in daily life in one of our communities. So I can't stress that enough because I've witnessed it so many times. There's a real burden being put on organizations like ours and others where people want us to be involved in projects. But there needs to be time given for us to be able to understand how it all fits, right? Like even thinking about timelines, you can't come and ask a community to be a part of something and a grant is due in a week. Like these are things that are literally going to take months and years to cultivate. And like Dr. Liboiron said, it's just because you get an invite or get into a community, that doesn't mean the work is done. And it's an ongoing relationship that has to exist beyond someone's degree or a funding call and so on. There's a responsibility to keep on going. And I guess maybe that sounds easy for me to say where I live here in a place, I'm from here, and I don't think I'm going anywhere. But it is something for people to think about when you're not from a particular region. How do you stay connected, and what is your responsibility when the research is done? So I think that's all connected to some of the main teachings that I would recommend.
I totally agree. So I have a personal role which comes out of some teachings that I don't do research where I'm not invited. And so it took me 4 years to get invited to do research in Labrador, in Nunatsiavut. And I think people had to watch me fish first, you know, check out my baggage. All your baggage comes out when you fish, right? What kind of person you are, what kind of person you aren't. Everyone can tell if you've been fishing all day and not doing very good, what you're like. And so after that, they're like, yeah, okay, we can handle you. This will be fine. And it took me 4 years to build enough relationships that I wasn't going up to Nunatsiavut as an outside jerk or someone who was there like fishing for research opportunities or that sort of stuff. So I definitely agree. And there are methods to building relationships, right? You listen more than you talk. You're supposed to listen for like a year, right? That kind of stuff. I would also say for teaching research methods that you always have to teach that they're political. They take sides. What questions you ask, what questions you don't ask, who you work with, who you don't work with. Like Elder White said, like all we want is that someone come and talk to us. So like whether that is the first step in your research or not, that's political, and it serves some groups more than others. So yeah, objectivity and apoliticalness is not, that idea serves some groups and not others too, right? So I don't think there's such a thing as a non-political way to do research.
Thanks, Max. So there's another question in the chat from Dean Babington, who you mentioned in your presentation, Max. So Dean asks, how might one think about commemorating the, so he mentioned that this chat, the original question seems to have disappeared, but he was asking about how the panel participants believe the 30th cod and salmon fishing moratoria ought to be remembered in a good way. And so maybe the panelists would like to answer that one in turn. And so he asks, again, how might one think about commemoration in a good way?
I think when there's a difference between commemorating something as good and commemorating in a good way. So like mourning and grieving is good, right? So there's, the 30th anniversary, yeah. So I think part of what Dr. Snook talked about was that like part of the provincial memory of the cod collapse and the moratorium is almost exclusively a settler story. And it doesn't remember how it actually impacted Indigenous groups additionally, differently, and equitably, how the rollouts and the things that came afterwards were very unevenly distributed and had some of the same problems and stuff like that. So sort of having a fuller set of stories, a fuller set of land relations involved in commemorations might be part of that. But I bet Elder White and Dr. Snook have more since they were actually there for it.
Well, the impact of Calvin here, the impact of the cod moratorium and the closure of the commercial fishing, salmon fishing, the closing of salmon fishing, it may have had a great impact on the Newfoundland population when it happened. But the impact on Aboriginal people, on my community, is still very visible today. It was not just something that happened and now it's over with and we can look at celebration. There is no celebration. What it is it has caused hardship in our way of life. It has taken away part of our diet. And there are still people today who are considered to be criminals because they chose, without any choice, because of their economic situation, to pursue, to some degree, that lifestyle. So what we've done is we've become criminals on our own land for the use of our own resources. So we're not about to celebrate what happened.
Thank you, Elder White. Jamie?
Yeah, no, I really, what Elder White just said really resonates with me, and I've heard from Inuit in the community of Reglet who were criminalized for harvesting caribou in the 50s and 60s after there were bans put in place on a specific caribou herd, and it was deeply hurtful when you go from harvesting an animal one day to being seen as a criminal the next day, and knowing that it's so intertwined with your identity and culture. And specific to the COD moratorium, in a lot of ways, I think people are owed an apology, and I'm sure people can argue that all of the people of our province are probably owed an apology. But I know in the context of the Nazi vote, I will say that they're still feeling like they haven't been heard, because their cod fishery was exploited and disappeared long before the actual moratorium in the early 1990s. So for me, when I was doing some of my research, it resonated with this academic concept, I guess, of ethical loneliness, just meaning that people are not feeling heard, they're not heard, and they're feeling abandoned by people that are in power and have the ability to do something about the situation. And like I said, if you try to talk about crab or shrimp or any modern day events in the fishery now in the Nazi vote, there's still a deep resentment about the way the cod fishery had disappeared in that region. And I think a commemoration almost needs a bit of recognition and acknowledgement of the impact that had on people, and it's gone unacknowledged to this day. And it's also had an impact on families and their ability to transition into modern day fisheries. So it's not something that just happened in the past. A lot of these issues are continuing to make their way through the decades and are still present today.
Thanks so much, Dr. Snook. Clearly drawing from your thesis, which must read. Looking forward to all the articles that are coming out on that. So there are two additional questions which are more about some of the academic sources that might be recommended. So Matthew Dutry asks, I was wondering if you have any recommended academic sources that situate land relations through the anti-colonial lens you deploy. I'm hoping to draw on some well-written literature for a community-based food growing project in Treaty 2 Michi-Sagic territory. And then Jacqueline Goldstein asks, Dr. Liboiron, you mentioned there are ways of building relations, e.g. listening for a year, which sounds like a useful prescription for wise application. I'd like to learn more about similar prescriptions for building relations. Is there a resource you would suggest? Thank you. So two questions about resources that people might be able to use.
So it's I mean, yeah, there's entire massive literatures about this, both from community writing and speaking and from academic sources. Thousands and thousands of sources. So what I've done when I wrote my book is that there's lots and lots of footnotes that explain sources and what they're like and how they relate to these ideas. And so I'd recommend that you look at the bibliography of the book or the footnotes in the book, which will outline some of these things. And also note that none of them are prescriptive, ever, 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 because they're always place-based. So nothing will work across cases. It's impossible. And so starting from where you are and starting in the places and communities that you're already obliged to and already part of, whether you want to be or not, whether you've made the decision or not, you are when you're on land. Starting from there, and that will tell you which literatures and which sources and which ways of doing things are most appropriate. So even like if I go up to Labrador and I bring tobacco with me, I make no sense. When I'm back home, you distribute tobacco like a house on fire, because that's you know, so things just don't travel, right? So you need to be place-based about it. So yeah.
Okay, so there aren't any questions in the chat, but I'd be happy to ask Max a question. Maybe, I mean, Max, when you describe the research that you do and the practices that that you deploy, a lot of them are, in a sense, the word that I might use is not captured in formal ethics clearances at the university. So, for example, community peer review or doing what you talked about in terms of going into a community beforehand to secure some, some kind of negotiation about research questions and so on. So is there a need to look critically at those kinds of sort of instruments in terms of the university itself?
I always get a little pissy when people crap on institutional IRBs because they're much, much better than nothing. I have 2 degrees in art, which have 0 ethics whatsoever. And holy crap, that is like the Wild West. And so like these fairly insufficient but necessary institutional ethics reviews are way better than nothing, even if they're also insufficient in various ways. The good news is every single group in this province and pretty much all the other ones that I know about in Canada and the United States and New Zealand and Australia have a version of ethics. So even actually Elder White could potentially talk about the one in Flat Bay, which involves going to Tim's and talking to people. There's not a paperwork form. You have to have what I really like about the Flat Bay protocol, to use it not super formal, is that it's not super formal. There isn't an online form like Nunatsiava, which has an online form with a Q&A and a little panel where you put things in and you press send on the internet. And so even though it's highly sophisticated, you don't need to have relationships to get started. Where if you want to go to Flat Bay, which is massively research intensive, especially for its size, you have to know who to call, right? And I think that's a really, I admire the way that Flat Bay does research ethics.
Well, what's happening, if I may, is that we've been trying to avoid a full immersion in colonialism. And all of this paper trails and all of these paperwork and all of these things are, to be quite honest with you, unnecessary. Because what we're leaning towards now is we've seen it. We've seen over the last number of years, I've had number of phone calls and we've had number of requests here at the band office for our signature on an application that was being submitted for funding. But that's all they were interested in. It had to be, if it was signed by, and somebody mentioned that earlier, I think it was Jamie, but that's so true. So what we've done is we've looked at that and said, no, any research that is going to take place in Flat Bay has to be something that is of benefit to our community, and we need to be included in the research and guaranteed a copy of the research upon its completion. Because we are tired of people talking about us. We want people to talk to us so we can identify our needs. And it's oh so easy to be able to go to Grenfelder's Memorial and say, look, we've got this idea of a project that we'd like an undertaking on, this research. Identify a prop to us that we can go to, and then that person then can identify a student. And that way, all of this paper trail of back and forth and all that can be kind of put aside, other than the normal legal requirements that will be necessary when the project starts. But the rest of it will be gone. And we know that we'll be getting a person who's going to be interested in what our community is interested in. And that person will also feel very comfortable in knowing that they were sought after instead of looking for us so they could get our name on a piece of paper for a project. So it's the colonialism part that that hadn't took over our community. Remember when I did my little spiel of my presentation, I talked about integration but not assimilation. Well, this is an example. Integration is being part of that system, be part of that education system. And God knows there's nobody promotes education any greater than I do. I know the loss that I experienced by quitting school when I was 13-year-old with a grade 7. But I made sure that it didn't happen with my children. And I make sure that anybody I can encourage in our community, any young people, that they will pursue that. So there is a value there for education, and that's the integration part. But the assimilation that we fight is not having to go through all of these unnecessary steps and to be programmed before you even get involved in the undertaking. Somebody has to interview you, somebody has to talk to you, somebody has to decide if this meets certain ethics, somebody else to decide if that's the appropriate thing to do, somebody else decides was it done somewhere else. We don't want any of that. Either we're going to have a relationship and we're going to have an undertaking, or just don't bother with us at all. Just as simple as that. I have no difficulty in being very blunt. And that's where we stand.
Thank you, Elder White. Dr. Snook, did you want to come in on this question?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left. So if anyone has any additional questions to Dr. Liboiron or other panel members.
And also finish early. Legit.
Well, Max, since I'm your uncle, the next time I'm in town, I'll have to give you a call. We'll have to have coffee.
Totally. And likewise, whenever I'm up visiting Kellyanne, I'll come say bye.
Oh, yeah. Great.
Cool.
So I see Anya has come up. Dr. Waite, do you want to perhaps wrap up? And we can finish early. This has been an extraordinary presentation and set of discussions. But maybe I could turn it to you, Dr. Waite.
Just a few comments is that I'm very pleased that I was invited to participate in this forum, and met some new people, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all in person and perhaps be able to continue our discussions. Who knows? We may even impose upon you to come to our community and get actively involved in some of our research, or suggest some of the things and how we should go about some of these things. But and I guess just to make it short, I'll offer you an open invitation to our powwow, which will be taking place on the 8th, 9th, and 10th of July.
I'll bring my ribbon shirt.
Yay.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Elder White. So there is one final question, which is from Genevieve Theriot, who says, I would be interested to know if Max Liboiron also speaks French.
Nope. Sorry. I speak English and Bad Mitchell. That's my list.
Nice to see you there, Genevieve. And I guess today all I'll say is I learned a lot and enjoyed very much hearing everything that was being said, and really appreciate, Max, your scholarship and the wisdom and thought that you've brought to this conversation. And what a privilege also to have our guests today to respond and weigh in on these really, really important issues. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the deeper and exciting engagement with Indigenous communities as we go forward. So thank you very much, everyone.